and welcome to what I found is the 17th annual East Asia Summit. Nice to be back into Kuala Lumpur. I think it's fair to say that one cannot write a more intriguing or a more complicated script for stewards of the regional and global economy these days, specifically for government leaders or for our chief executives. Every single day you wake up, you see a new headline relating to what I'm talking about. Record energy and food prices are reaching into every level of society, sparking protests, especially in the region, as we found out, with consumers seeking relief. A credit crisis in the U.S., which has spread across the Atlantic and has central bankers scratching their heads and trying to weigh the real threats out there today, a slowdown versus rising inflation. And unlike previous jolts to the global trading system, which came from here in Asia, or Russia, or Latin America over the past 2 decades, this one was born in the US of A, and unusual in that the developing world to date has provided the growth to cushion the downturn. Think about that. If we didn't have the growth that we have in Asia today. I'm not sure how many of you read the book or the subsequent movie with George Clooney called The Perfect Storm, but it's about the great northeastern storm off the coast of New England when 3 weather fronts collided and created an eerie calm before they collided to create a monster of a storm which wiped out an entire fishing fleet. I do think it's an apt analogy to the storm that is brewing today. For those of you who have lived through the past economic cycles, it is clearly evident, if you take a step back from what I'm thinking here, that this one is really unlike any other. We have a skyrocketing inflation environment, a shortage of fuel in the midst of an economic slowdown. And you just need to basically take a look at the headlines every single day to see what I'm talking about. Yesterday's International Herald Tribune, front right column, protest in widened Asia over fuel costs. From the very top of East Asia down here into Southeast Asia. Morning paper today, New Sunday Times, the mad scramble in a response by Prime Minister Badawi to lift the fuel subsidies before, then provide some relief, taking the temperature of society today to make sure that this does not infringe on the management of the public. Meanwhile, which I find very fascinating when you see protests on the front page of the paper or in your favorite news channel, the developing world should be really described not as the developing world, but D squared or D.20, meaning that these economies are much further along the maturity cycle than most predicted just 5 years ago, to the point where structures like the G7 seem very outdated all of a sudden. I'm not sure if you felt the same way, but I was looking at the Osaka meeting of the G7 this weekend of finance ministers, and there was discussion about, yes, we'd like OPEC to put more energy onto the market. Yes, we need a collective response to the food and energy crisis that we have today, but no real clear solutions or clear dialogue in which to move forward. So that's what I'd like for us to cover in the next hour and a half, the real roadmap forward to real solutions going forward. Now, there's some key questions for us to ask in this next hour and a half. How strong are the mass supporting the Asian economies after the last 10 years of a downturn, 1997, 98? How much have we learned in that 10-year cycle to resist the downturn? Is this new Silk Route for real, this belt of growth of investment from North Africa going into the Middle East, going into South Asia, into Central Asia, and then defining the new Silk Route as it arcs down into Southeast Asia today? And will this economic cycle answer the assumed premise articulated in Davos this year that Asia will decouple from the United States and stand economically on its own 2 feet? Before we get started into that panel discussion, I'd like to invite one of the managing directors of the World Economic Forum to join me on the stage here to give welcoming remarks. Let me invite up Borge Brende of the World Economic Forum and say good morning to him. Borge?
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this 17th World Economic Forum on East Asia. This is an important time to deliberate the current political, social, and economic trends, together with more than 300 leaders from our 25 countries, representing governments, business, and regional institutions, at a time where new realities ask us to set an agenda to ensure this region's continued growth. The question a lot of actors are asking now is whether Asia, which so far has escaped the fallout from the subprime crisis, can maintain its growth momentum even against quite strong headwinds. Asia's economic performance has been consistently outstanding in recent years. And the phrase rapid growth and Asia are almost identical. This summit is about responding in a proactive manner to new uncertainties. It is, though, important to remember and remind ourselves of something that the chairman of the board of Nestle, Mr. Peter Brabeck, said this morning during the press conference. Let's not use this occasion to talk ourselves into a recession. The adjustments we are seeing now are probably necessary, but let's forget the domestic demand in Asia remains extremely strong. Trade within Asia is growing faster than trade between Asia and the rest of the world, and Asian corporations boost healthy balance sheets. What this opening plenary, I believe, will be able to get, we will get a good barometer reading on what leaders feel now, not only about new uncertainties, but also about the many opportunities which exist still in East Asia. We wish ourselves a very good summit. Thank you.
Jorge, thanks for that, and a taste of some of the discussion we're going to have here in the next 90 minutes. If I talk a little bit slower than I normally do, to make sure that our respected ministers here understand exactly what we're saying, so we can have an even better dialogue to go forward. But I'd like to start with one of our host companies here from Khazanah, Tantri Azman, Mokhtar, and discuss where we are today in terms of the cycle. You were in Davos this year, and there's a great discussion about decoupling. Could Asia stand on its own 2 feet and learn from the lessons of the Asia crisis, 1997 and 1998? There's been a downturn as a result of the credit crunch in the United States. But is Malaysia, for example, in a much better position to manage the downturn? How much impact has it really provided?
Thank you, John. We are sitting here in 2008. I think this hotel probably hosted many events 10 years ago. The mood then was probably much glamour. The 10 years, by and large, has not been a lost decade. I think it's been a decade that not just Malaysia, I think the rest of crisis Asia has really come back much stronger. And we're not just talking about headline numbers of forex reserves and GDP growth, per capita incomes. I think more fundamentally there's been a very real improvement, for example, in corporate governance, very real improvement in the institutions of running macro economics, for example. I think if you talk on the new financial architecture, which at a global level is still something that every time we hit one of these crises, this question will come out, but certainly at the regional level, the cooperation among central banks, for example, and so on. So the first point is really a crisis Asia, 10 years later, is much stronger, and we're back. It has meant, for example, in Southeast Asia, the rates of growth have actually moderated to in the order of about 6%, which is a problem if you look at the theoretical capacity of these economies as well as the demands of the various constituents. But I think your decoupling question and whether Asia can take leadership, I would answer in two ways, really. The short answer, in the short run, the answer is yes. I think Asia will take up the slack of whatever is happening in the other side of the world. But in the medium to long term, the jury is still out, because if you look at all the various sustainable factors of production, notwithstanding that if one were to look at some of the really long run trends, the famous numbers by Madison, for example, and that traditionally China, India and Asia is perhaps 50% and we're only about 20% of global economy now. So clearly that number is going to go up. But whether this is sustainable in terms of leadership is another question. Does Asia have the institutions? Does Asia, for example, have the inclusiveness? Does Asia have the innovation to lead in the long run? I think it's going to be a much more the so-called multipolarity thesis, if you like. Okay, so in a nutshell, the view from where we're sitting here and the areas that we cover in Khazanah, I think clearly there's still a lot of energy and optimism, not just in the Pacific Ocean, increasingly very much so in the Indian Ocean, all the way from Middle East into India, into our part of the world. But I think beyond that really, and I'm sure the other panelists will answer that, it will need very much a multi-pronged response on both, to cater for this, or rather to address these global imbalances. Thank you.
Thank you. Marcus, if I can call upon you to give us the global perspective. I find it almost surreal when I turn on the television and I watch the weekend G7 meeting, and then the weekend before that, it was a G7 energy ministers making kind of bold cries for some help here from the OPEC nations. This next Sunday in Jeddah, there's going to be a meeting of producing and consuming nations to sit down and form a dialogue. But the reality is today, in this economic downturn, which again is G8-led, not from Asia in particular, the institutions don't support a rapid response. And is this what this downturn is showing us, that the cracks in the system require much different institutions to deal with crises?
I think the short answer to that is yes. If we can start with...
Marcus, if you just bring the microphone forward.
Is that better? Yeah. If we can start with a couple of anecdotes of what we've seen, certainly in the West, with the credit crunch. If part of this debate is about decoupling, the other half of that is connectivity. And I think everybody in the West was astonished by the extent of the connectivity, which was evidenced by the credit crunch. What started out as a small local difficulty, if you like, in the subprime mortgage area of the North American capital market, spread like wildfire. And I think there was no one who was not surprised by the speed with which it spread and the extent to which it spread out. And I know that Asia has avoided much of that, but it did seem to go much further than people had expected and much faster. So the reason I make that point is when one looks at the whole question of how well the world is wired together, how well the connectivity works, my instinct is it's much greater than people think it is. As to your question of the ability of the world institutions to respond to that, first of all, my first comment would be, I think as you said earlier, Peter, the world institutions look pretty out of date. When you see these meetings of world leaders, you see not so much who is there, but who is not there. And we haven't yet got to the situation where Asia is given the political position that is commensurate with its economic position. And that I do think needs to be fixed. But as we go forward, and I have to emphasize, I'm not a politician or anything even close to being a politician. I am nervous about the scale of the challenge facing the politicians, because as I look, not just in the West, but also in Asia, it seems to me that when you compare the current crisis with what happened 10 years ago, which was dealt with, I think, magnificently by the various different countries in Asia, now there are bigger problems. And those two problems in particular are not just the peak in the cost of fuel and of food and of raw materials, but also in the far greater income inequalities which exist in many of the countries. And this, it seems to me, just ratchets up the political pressure on the people who have to solve it. And it's not just in Asia that we're seeing this. We're seeing this also in the West. And one of the things that has made me nervous about the recent or the current US presidential elections is the extent to which the protectionism is beginning to raise its head, the threat of protectionism. So to conclude, my real fear about the response to all of this is that in different places and in different ways, instead of going forward, we might actually go backwards. And we might find new regulations, tighter conditions, and a reaction against the liberal policies which have actually served us so well in the last 10 years.
Thanks. It's quite a bold statement. In fact, it's a question I'd like to bring to Mr. Sinha, if I may here. I was present, fortunately, as a journalist to cover the final GATT round, which created the evolution of the World Trade Organization in Geneva. And at that time, and Professor Schwab and I were reminiscing about it recently, you had a case where it was an institution dominated by the United States, the European Union, and in some part by Japan, writing the rules, 75, 80% of the rules here. Do you have the same fears that Mark has laid out here, that if we don't adapt institutions like the WTO or create a G13 or a G15 quite rapidly, then we could have the tendency to slip into a protectionist response out of Washington and transition to an administration?
John, yes. I think there is a distinct possibility of that happening. I entirely agree with the thesis that the international institutions that we have at the moment, including the WTO, are woefully inadequate to meet the global challenges. And apart from WTO, I'd like to tell you, we have been talking about the G7 or the US-generated financial crisis that is affecting the world at the moment. If it had been any other country in the world from Asia or Latin America or Africa, a whole huge team from the IMF would have descended on the capital of that country to advise that country as to what it should be doing. What is the IMF doing about the US? Here is a major regulatory failure in the form of the subprime crisis, and the IMF is just keeping quiet. Nothing is happening. Here are world oil prices rising astronomically, and apart from what you have said about the King Abdullah initiative, there is nothing happening at the global institutional level to tackle the problem, bringing together the producers and the importing countries so that we could arrive at some solutions. So my take on this is that the global institutions are inadequate. They are not responding to the global challenges as they are emerging, including the food crisis, the Rome meeting notwithstanding. And I would say that this is where there is an opportunity for Asia. There are a whole host of things which Asian nations can do together. And therefore, we must come together. We must start writing the rules of the game. We must start determining the challenges and the mode to meet with them in future. If we fail, then we'll be the worst impacted upon. Because as you said in your introductory remarks, that if we are providing the bulk of the incremental growth globally, I mean, I'll give you the example of India. The worst prognosis for India for 2008 is that we'll grow at 7%, which is not bad at all. We grew at 9% last year. But what will happen to this growth in view of the global challenges? So we have, as Asian nations, a vested interest and an immediate interest in making sure that the global institutions respond to global crisis as indeed they should.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Minister Watanabe, if I may. And I didn't know if I was reading my research correctly when I dug through it, because some of the bolder statements you've suggested, saying a suggestion to Washington, D.C. that a financial overhaul in the greatest extent needs to be implemented. That was at the late part of April. And you described the crisis that we're seeing in the United States right now, which has developed these storm clouds off the coast of Europe right now as the greatest threat to the financial system since the Great Depression. I've been impressed quite candidly that we've been able to buffer the global economy, and the Asian growth has out-buffer the deepness of that crisis that we have in America. But what are you suggesting here in terms of the severity of it, and is the worst of it over from your vantage point in Japan?
日本はですね、ベルリンの壁が崩壊をして、真っ先に金融危機に見舞われた国です。その後、アジアが通貨危機に見舞われました。日本もアジア通貨危機と同時に金融危機を深刻化させたわけです。今、アジアは一つの船に乗っているのと同じ状況だと思うんですね。で、アジア危機の後、アジア各国は輸出主導型の政策を取りました。日本もその路線を進めました。そして外貨準備を蓄えました。アメリカにおいては IT バブル崩壊後、グリーンスパン議長の大変、上手な金融政策の運営によって、バブルではなくてフロスという表現で、住宅が牽引をする、そういう経済を作ってきたわけです。結局アメリカが借金をして世界中から物を買ってくれる、これは大変我々にとってはありがたいお金の循環だったと思います。しかし残念ながらサブプライムローン問題が引き起こした金融資本市場の大混乱というのは、ドル体制そのものに対する揺らぎまで引き起こしてしまったという点で、大恐慌以来の大変な危機のマグニチュードだったと私も思っております。日本が真っ先に金融危機を経験をいたしておりますので、私の感覚からいたしますと、十数年前に我々が直面した構造と基本的にはよく似ているなと思っています。1月のダボス会議では私はこのことをデジャブと申し上げました。日本は90年代を通して財政出動によってこの危機を克服しようといたしました。だいたい 1.3 兆ドルぐらいの景気対策をやりました。しかし残念ながらそれだけではうまくいかなかった。早い話が湯船にお湯をためようとしてるんですが、お湯がたまらないんですね。というのは、お風呂の底がでっかい穴が開いていて全部水が漏れてしまうからです。で、日本はまず穴の大きさを測る物差しがありませんでした。まず物差しを作ったんです。そして公的資金を投入をして、このバスタブの底を修理をいたしました。そこから日本経済が回復を始めたということです。日本の教訓として言えることは、リクイディティの危機の背景にはソルベンシーの問題があるということです。このソルベンシーの問題は個々の金融機関の問題にかかわらず、金融システム全体のソルベンシーの問題につながっているということです。そして、資産を査定をする共通の尺度、これがないと危機は深刻化するということです。例えば今アメリカにおいてレベル3マーク2モデルの証券化商品の価格が非常に不透明であるという問題が指摘をされているのは、まさに日本が経験をしたことと同じことなんですね。日本が危機をずっと長いこと続けてしまったのは、迅速果敢に最終的な解決手段を取るのに手間取ってしまったということで 公的資金を投入をすることは政治的責任を伴います。行政の責任を伴います。したがって非常に厄介だということが言えます。まさにこういう問題を克服することによって、株式市場からその他のコモディティ市場に流れているお金が正常状態に戻ってくることを私は期待をいたします。
If I can ask a very quick follow-up, because I haven't gotten through the panel yet. You would not argue with me when I said that the recovery in Japan was painfully slow, because as you said, a lot of the water was leaking out of the bottom of the bathtub and we didn't really find a solution. Are you suggesting that the U.S. recovery could take equally as long as a result of not marking the book to bill on some of the assets that the banks are holding now?
これは G7 の問題かもしれません。私は G7 メンバーではございませんが、日本の経験からいたしますと、まだ本質的な解決が終わったとは到底言えない気がいたします。ヨーロッパの巨大複合金融機関においてはさらにディスクロージャーがアメリカに比べて遅れています。ですからこれはアメリカの住宅価格の値下がりがどこまで続くかという問題も含めてさらに注意深く見ていく必要があろうかと思います。日本の場合には、もうすでに FSF 報告に従ってサブプライム商品以外の証券化商品まで含めて全預金取扱金融機関がどれぐらいのエクスポージャーを持ってどれぐらいの損失を出しているかということもすでに発表いたしております。こういうディスクロージャーが進むことこそが疑心暗鬼、マーケットの疑心暗鬼を収束させることになるわけでございます。いずれにいたしましてもソルベンシーの問題までつながっているということを認識すべきだと思います。
Thank you for your candor. If I can move to Minister Vuven Ninh of Vietnam, and in my opening remarks we talked about the severity of the challenge today. Day in and day out, governments having to deal with food shortages,